Hey, what's going on, guys? My name is Griffin, and I'm a filmmaker based out of Orange County, California. And today we're going to be talking about the Canon C70 versus the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K Pro. So in this test, I'm going to focus on a couple things. First one's going to be image quality. Second's going to be overexposure. Third one is going to be underexposure. Fourth one's going to be slow motion. And then I'm going to talk about some additional features of each camera that make them unique. And lastly, I'll close it out with some of my thoughts on each of the cameras and who I think they're best suited for. So jumping right into it for image quality, I think both these cameras are really solid. I really like the image you can get out of either of these cameras. I would say the image is actually more similar than it is different. So much so that I actually use the exact same LUT. I actually use one of my custom LUTs that I sell. It's a Canon LUT for C-Log2, mostly for cameras like the C70, but I actually use that on the Blackmagic Pocket 6K, and it looked amazing. I thought it looked really solid too. So that's how close these cameras are in terms of image quality. I would say the biggest things that make these cameras different in terms of image quality comes from the speed booster that you can use with the C70. I think that kind of changes the way that things look substantially. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later in this video, but in terms of the actual quality of the image, I think it's really solid for both. Jumping into overexposure, both these cameras do well. If I had to pick one, I'd say the Pocket 6K actually does just a little bit better. Now the reason for that is Blackmagic has a really nice RAW codec. It's really similar to Red RAW, where you can just go in and change the ISO. So say you captured at ISO 800 and you were 2 stops overexposed, boom, you just drop it down to ISO 200, and now you've got a perfectly exposed image. With the C70, it's got a lot of latitude, so if you overexpose, you'll be okay to pull it back for quite a bit. And I would say you can pull it back just as much, if not more, but the only issue is you kind of have to go in and do it manually. So depends how you like to grade. I'm sure some people will tell me I do it wrong, but if you go in like on the sliders and the basic corrections and you pull your highlights down, you drop your blacks, you drop your shadows, then you can get the image to look basically the same, get all that highlight detail back. But it's a little bit more tedious to do this way, and it requires a little bit more experience and taste, you could say, to know how far you can go. Whereas with the Blackmagic Pocket 6K, you can just go right in and change the ISO, and it makes things quite a bit easier. In terms of underexposure, I'd say the C70 is probably the best camera I've ever tested. It's better actually even than my C500 Mark II. The shadows are unbelievably clean, even if you underexpose the image. So you can see this image here of Delaney. I exposed for the highlights, and I just completely underexposed her. Once you pull that back up, you'll notice that there's basically no noise present in the image at all. When I exposed the image the same way on the Pocket 6K Pro and then pulled it up in post using the RAW controls, you could just see there's already a ton of noise present in the image. This is a camera that really likes to have a lot of light, and it doesn't like to be underexposed. So that's something to note if you are using the camera. I would say you'll want to expose a little more to the right, and you won't really want to underexpose the image, whereas it's kind of the opposite on the C70. And just for fun, I went and did the same test, but 4 stops under, so you can see, I mean, it's like literally, I would never expose this way, but it's totally underexposing the subject massively. And then you can see when I pull it back, you actually have a pretty usable image, even at 4 stops underexposed. And you can see when you do the same thing on the Pocket 6K, it's nowhere near usable. And even if you run some denoiser on it, which I tried, it just doesn't look the same. When it comes to 120p, these cameras are pretty different. I'd say the Pocket 6K Pro has usable 120p for sure. As long as you don't need to capture anything too wide in the frame, you can get by. When it comes to the C70, what's one of my favorite things about that camera is it can actually capture full sensor 120p with no crop. And when you're using a speed booster, it's got a full frame field of view. So it's not exactly full frame, I know that, but it looks like it's full frame. You can see here's my buddy Tommy. He's hitting the bag in 120 slow motion. Now, here's what the crop looks like of the Pocket 6K. This is at the exact same distance from the subject. The cameras were actually placed on the same exact tripod. So you'll see what a huge significant crop that is. Now, that may or may not be important for you. Not everybody uses 120p. If you shoot boxing like I do, you're probably going to end up using it sometimes. So that's why it is important for me, and that's one of the things I like about the C70. In terms of features, I'd say there's a couple things that make each of these cameras special. Starting out with the Pocket 6K, I'd say one of my favorite things about this camera is the fact that it's got a 5-inch tilting screen built right into the camera that's daylight viewable. This is, as far as I know, the only camera that's got really a usable screen right out of the box. It's 1500 nits and it tilts and it's completely usable. And I know the color's a little bit off, but Blackmagic's actually pretty good with firmware updates. So I know and I trust that they'll have a firmware update to fix the weird color. But this is really nice. I mean, the ability to just grab this camera and not have to put a secondary monitor on top, or if you don't have a monitor, maybe you haven't bought one yet, it's really nice that it's got one that's usable right out of the box. That's a pretty huge feature, and I'd really love to see some other camera manufacturers adopt this. The second thing I'd want to talk about that I really like about this camera is I just love the menus. The way that they lay out the menus, it's got this big, bright, beautiful touchscreen interface. It's easy to understand. It's got all the things you're looking for. And I'm typically a Canon shooter. I was able to pick this camera up, get right into the menus, find all the settings that I want. Nothing's buried super deep in there. Whereas I've been shooting Canon for years and still I'm like discovering features in the menu that I didn't know were there. So I'd really say that I like the menus a lot in the Pocket 6K Pro. Last thing I'll say about this camera, one of the things that was holding me back from getting the original Pocket 4K or Pocket 6K was the fact that it didn't have ND filters built in and it didn't really have a very usable battery. Now with this battery grip, you can get about 3 hours battery life, which is totally fine for professional work. And it's got ND filters built in, up to 6 stops, which is really nice. Once you've used a camera with built-in ND filters, it makes it super tough to go back. And so that's one of the things I love about the Pocket 6K, that they included that in this camera. Jumping over to the C70, some of the things I like, it's got a flip screen, but I would say some of the things that really set this one apart are the fact that it's got totally usable autofocus. And I know some people might say, hey, well, you should just learn to pull focus yourself, or look, I know how to pull focus just fine. But having autofocus is a really nice feature. And if you're using your camera on, say, like a gimbal, and you want to track someone's face because you're shooting shallow depth of field, that's a really nice feature to have built in. Also, if you're tracking things that move really quickly, like an athlete running across a field, a car driving towards you or something like that, you're going to have an easier time using the autofocus on the C70. The second thing I would say about the C70 that's definitely my favorite feature, you can use the Canon Speed Booster. And what this does is it gives you one extra stop of light. So if you're shooting ISO 400, it increases the amount of light. So it'd be equivalent to ISO 800. So that's really cool. But what it can also do is it makes the field of view of your lenses wider, and it gives you a shallower depth of field, mimicking what a full frame sensor would look like, even though this is only Super 35. So I typically shoot with a 1DX Mark III or a Canon C500. The fact that this has a speed booster, it can pair perfectly with those cameras. My favorite thing about the speed booster is the way that it can give you a shallower depth of field. So here's Delaney, and this is just with the regular stock Canon adapter. And now here's with the speed booster. I match the field of view, so I just zoom the lens in just a little bit because it's going to give you a wider field of view. And in turn, what that does is it gives you a shallower depth of field. So you don't need that for every single shot, but it's definitely a nice feature to have built into the camera for those times when you do need it. So to close things out, who are these cameras for? Well, to start things off, the Pocket 6K is, in my opinion, the best cinema camera you can get at that price point by a long shot. The image quality that you get is amazing. The fact that it comes at $2,500, it's got a completely usable screen. You don't need to go buy an extra screen. It's got XLR audio built in, mini XLR audio. It's got ND filters. In my opinion, as long as you don't need autofocus, it's an unbelievable camera at an unbelievable price point. I really like what Blackmagic is doing for the industry. I feel like even at the bottom of the lineup for Blackmagic, they really pack their cameras with a ton of features, and they make them so they can match up with some of the top of the line cameras in the industry. As far as the C70 goes, if it's in your budget, I would say this camera offers a little bit more in terms of features. It's going to give you really nice autofocus, which is great for like corporate interviews or if you're putting the camera on a gimbal. And also the body design has a much easier time fitting on a Ronin S or Ronin S2 than the 6K Pro does. I would say the fact that it's got 10 stops of built-in NDs is really nice as well, instead of the 6 that are built into the Pocket 6K Pro. So if you want to shoot shallow depth of field and it's a bright sunny day, that's a nice feature as well. Another thing I really love, like I mentioned earlier, is the speed booster. It's really nice that it'll give you that full frame field of view, and that's not something you can do on the Pocket 6K Pro. Lastly, for me, this one's a little more specific for me. Sometimes on larger shoots where I'm using my C500 as the A-cam, I like to use PL mount cinema glass. Now with the RF mount on the C70, you can put PL mount cinema glass on here, whereas that's not something you can really do with the Pocket 6K Pro. So when it comes to choosing between these two cameras, I think you really just have to look at which of these features are going to be most important for you and the type of work that you do. So anyways, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this video today. And if you like this type of content, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.